So whiteness found its way into statutory law at the outset of the founding of this country. However, as we've discussed in earlier episodes, particularly our immigration-focused episodes, that race is really a shorthand for social hierarchy, and that whiteness is shorthand for being at the top of that hierarchy. For most regions of the United States, what was defined as a full card-carrying white person was pretty fluid until the latter half of the 20th century. Certain European immigrant groups, such as Italians, Irish, and Jews, were what I like to call whitish. They could attend whites-only schools. If they married a WASP, it wasn't considered an interracial relationship or marriage. And they were considered higher than Asians, Blacks, and Indigenous people, but they certainly experienced discrimination within whiteness. And I say most regions because in the US, in the South, the Black-white binary was a lot easier to define, and it was much easier to be a white person in the South, quite frankly, than it was in other regions of the United States. So, for example, it would be easier as an Irish immigrant to be white in Alabama or Mississippi in the 1920s than it would have been for the same Irish immigrant to be white in Boston. So in the 1920s, while whitish folks outside of the South were navigating their precarious position within whiteness, country music's predecessor was born in Bristol, Tennessee, as an established genre that was branded as belonging to poor white Southern men. Would you agree with that?
I would absolutely agree with that. And that was a really, I think, accurate description not only of the roots of hillbilly and country music, but also of the way that whiteness has worked and has intersected with culture. Absolutely.
And you're listening to our brilliant guest who I haven't introduced yet. But last Monday, we chatted about the creation of Race Records, its evolution to R&B, and its direct relationship to pop music, and how both of these genres, even our contemporary understanding of them, are racialized music categories. Today, we're going to talk about the meticulous architecture of the myth of country music. I'm really excited to explore this with Dr. Charles L. Hughes. Charles is the author of Country Soul, Making Music and Making Race in the American South, which was named by Rolling Stone as one of the best music books of 2015. His forthcoming book, Why Bushwick Bill Matters, will be released next year. Charles is the director of the Lynne and Henry Turley Memphis Center at Rhodes College, where he is also an assistant professor of urban studies, history, and Africana studies. Hi, Charles. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
It's going to be a great conversation. So, oftentimes when I read about country music, I often see folk music come up. I was reading a bit about folk music, just trying to understand what it is. And Brooklyn College had a really informative music appreciation website. They said it's that Western culture divides musical practices into two broad fields, the vernacular and the cultivated. Cultivated would be what is considered high culture that one would hear in, let's say, conservatory, concert hall, and what they called high church. I had a difficult time understanding what high church meant, but that's what they called it. And then vernacular refers to your everyday informal music. And then vernacular is then divided into two domains of folk music, which is orally transmitted and community-based, and popular music, mediated for a mass audience. Does country music take its roots from folk music?
That is such an interesting question. It does, but it also takes roots in pop music. And I think one of the things that leads to a lot of mythology in country music and about country music, positive, negative, of all different kinds, is that we primarily associate it with folk music and with these sort of timeless traditions that were created among people who were isolated from pop music or isolated from the marketplace or isolated from each other. And certainly there's truth to that. You know, when you think about everything from folk songs in Appalachia to the blues and to other things. But at the same time, country music and hillbilly music, which was the name that it had when it first emerged, was very much connected to the other side of the vernacular tradition, right? Which is that kind of pop music space. Early musicians and audiences who we would associate with the roots of country music, all of them, to a person, were very aware of everything from Broadway show tunes to Tin Pan Alley to blackface minstrelsy to jazz to all of these different traditions. And they were really incorporating them into what they were doing. So country music is definitely rooted in those sort of folk traditions. And it's rooted in a multiracial mixture of folk traditions, which sometimes folks assume that it's just the kind of white side of things, and it's not at all. But it is at the same time entirely connected to what was going on at the beginning of the 20th century in music halls and vaudeville theaters and parlor pianos and all of the early recordings that were being made sometimes far away, you know, from the holler or the field or wherever we might associate the roots of the music. So that to me is one of the really key things to understand, is that country is rooted in folk music, but it is also very much rooted in pop music. And it's a record industry creation. The term hillbilly music, like the term race records that you spoke about last time, is a creation of the recording industry. There was no such thing as country music before it was made as a way to categorize and sell. And that doesn't mean it's not legitimate or that it doesn't have meaning. But it is an interesting thing to remember that the whole idea of country music is a creation of the pop recording industry.
Well, one of the things I want to just talk about is what's so interesting is, like, when I think about folkish things,
right.
And I think of square dancing, the banjo, and the fiddle. Those were the three things that I thought about, right? But none of those things in my imagination, I don't ever consider those things, for better or for worse, I don't ever consider them to be associated with Black people. And so square dancing is actually, I found out, the official state folk dance in 31 states. According to a peer-reviewed research article named Square Dance Calling, the African-American Connection, the author, Philip A. Jameson, says that today, few people know about the pivotal role Black people once played in helping develop this American dance tradition. It has a deep African-American history that's rooted in the legacy of slavery. The connection can be found in the callers, who prompt dancers to adopt different figures like the do-si-do and the alemande. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. But the callers, they became a prominent part of the dance because white people, they needed someone to play their music, according to this peer-reviewed article. And so, you know, the square dancing apparently grew out of Europe, but it became a distinctly American art form, dance form. And as white colonists learned new dances and modified old ones, they relied on enslaved Black people to perform their music. And then, you know, as white Americans developed their own more complex dance styles like quadrilles, which adapted from French dance forms, African-American fiddlers and musicians came along with them, which brings up the fiddle. At first, the dancers had to memorize them with the help of dance masters. But they had to be, you know, when they took the ballroom floor, just to have people help them, they were accompanied by Black people, apparently. So I guess Black and white people, which was like crazy to me, that Black people and white people in the South would be so close to each other.
Right.
And then enslaved Africans started to adapt these popular dances themselves. And, you know, then, you know, it's this American dance form. It's not associated with white people, right? Like in this just telling of it, like you see Black people and white people doing it together, Black people forming the music. So that's square dancing. So that's established that that's not white. The banjo, which I don't even need to go into detail, right? Like that's pretty much established that it came over with enslaved Africans. It's pretty accepted that this is an African instrument. And then there were the fiddlers. Like I said, it came up in the square dancing, but apparently when I was doing my research, I learned that that fiddling was actually very common among African Americans. You probably know this better than I do. Up until the early 20th century, there was, fiddlers. There was the very famous Booker Orchestra, a quartet led by a black fiddle player from Kentucky named Jim Booker. His band traveled to Richmond, Indiana, to record music for Janet Records. So all of these things, it's just so interesting to me how Black contributions tend to get written out of America's mainstream telling of what folksy roots look like.
Absolutely. And one of the things that's so important about that is what you were saying about that it's not just that it becomes, it's not only that Black legacy or influence or even the creation of these forms gets erased in favor of it becoming a white thing. It just sort of folds into becoming an American thing, which is synonymous in so many of the ways we talk about it with whiteness, right? And those are all such perfect examples. I mean, there's nothing in a sense more representative of cultural appropriation in the United States than the banjo in particular becoming something that is not only not thought of as a Black instrument, but is thought of as the whitest possible white instrument, right? And it's so fantastic that in recent years, through the work of Rhiannon Giddens and other artists, and also through so many scholars and folks doing the work, that has been reclaimed. Because even when I started, doing my own research and becoming part of this, that story was only just starting to really be told again. But you're absolutely right. And it's very much, I think, reflective of how the way in which we talk about music, whether country music or anything else, and we think about it in terms of race, it's often sort of framed around the idea. And this is something that is very, very common, especially in the kind of post-civil rights movement age, when narratives of integration became sort of more culturally acceptable as ways to talk about our supposed progress, even though a lot of time we actually hadn't made the progress, but we could tell a story about it. One of the things that happens is that the story of music in the United States when it relates to race is that it is often framed around the idea that if Black and white people are making music together, that therefore must mean inherently that something racially progressive is happening. This is such a common narrative. You hear it over and over again. That when the Black folks started making music with the white folks, that automatically somehow led to racial understanding and racial progress. And that's just not the case. White folks have always wanted to hear Black music. They've always, back to slavery, demanded that Black musicians play for them. And this notion that that there can be this kind of racial, that once white people hear and absorb Black music, that therefore it leads to racial progress, that not only helps perpetuate the erasures that you're talking about, because all of a sudden then white folks get to be the hero of the story because we were the ones who were broad-minded and we were the ones who were thinking outside the box, but it also leads to that erasure. Instead of thinking of this as a collaborative process that is often very fraught and that is often very uneven, instead of thinking that way, we just get this incredibly simplified idea of Black influences on white people being some demonstration of greater freedom, which is not true. Maybe for white people, maybe more freedom for white people, but certainly historically, there is absolutely the opposite of any evidence that this happened. And country music is too often kind of happy to live with its Black influence as a symbol of the more complicated story. And it's really important that we tell the story of that Black influence and the brown influence and the international influence. But that is often then the resting place that prevents conversations about how can country music actually be actively engaged in pursuing racial equality. It's not enough that we acknowledge the banjo as an African instrument. It's that we have to take that knowledge and apply it to a much, much deeper and ongoing conversation. And country's not alone in not having that conversation at all. But it's a particularly clear example historically of that erasure and that mythology that props up not just whiteness in terms of the investment of white identity, but literally props up, capital and power, because it allows white folks to sort of congratulate ourselves and not really do any work beyond that.
And I also think that you really make a great point about this notion of if Black people and white people are making things together, that somehow it will promote racial understanding. Even as I was, I'm sorry, I have to just go back to the square dance. The white people didn't want to play their own music. They're like, well, we just want to dance. So we're going to have you play our music. We're going to have you call out there. We're going to have you teach the people who don't really know the steps and things like that. We're going to have you do that. It certainly didn't lead to, like, I think, any progressiveness. Just like even if you think about before the recording industry, right? Just like people doing this on a communal level, I don't know, I'm assuming they're in barns or wherever they are, in their own small communities doing this. I'm sure when the square dance was over, you know what I mean? Everybody, and it's like, your place, I know mine type thing. So.
And that is exactly it. Like, where does everybody go when it's over? Like, that's a story that doesn't get told enough. So you're absolutely right. And another thing about square dancing, particularly, that's so fascinating, but also, again, very, I think, representative of this deeper story, is that square dancing, one of the reasons for the popularization of square dancing in the early 20th century, one of the reasons why it becomes the official dance of all these states and becomes a kind of a phenomenon and continues to be something that a lot of people really enjoy and a lot of people have, adapted and adopted and all of this. One of the reasons for this is that square dancing was championed by Henry Ford, who was, a notorious racist and anti-Semite. And he was deeply concerned about the popularity of jazz and the way in which jazz dancing in the 1920s and 30s, he felt was just horrible. He felt it was far too representative of a kind of amalgamation and degeneracy. All the stuff that's said about hip hop was said about jazz in the 20s and 30s, sometimes to the same words that were used. And so Ford, using his power and prominence, holds up square dancing as this different kind of tradition. So musical nostalgia is a consistently weaponized thing in the United States. And country being so rooted in nostalgia at its best, at its very, very best, one of the things that makes country music so powerful is that it is trying to reckon with the memory of what came before, whether it's in your own life or whether it's, in your town. And the brilliant music critic David Cantwell calls this the backward glance. He says the country music, it's not like we're going back, but we're standing and we're looking back, right? So country has that at its core, and that's why it's so powerful for so many people. But that nostalgia can be really dangerous when it is tied to the ongoing and sometimes very powerful attempt to return the United States to some mythical period where supposedly everything was better, but what it really means is that, among other things, Black folks and other non-white folks didn't have as much power. That is always at the core of political nostalgia, and it is very much at the core of how people try to weaponize country music's nostalgia. And you can see it with Henry Ford, and you can see it right up through more modern eras where, the use of the Confederate flag and this discussion of the Old South as this idyllic place, which of course started with blackface minstrelsy, again, kind of tying back to pop music. And also, quite frankly, the way that we have this real, for the last few years, we've had this real kind of boom in country songs about this sort of utopian small town or this utopian rural community. This idea of like, if I can just get on the back road and go home, or if I, out here, we don't need all the stuff you have in the city. Well, that's, of course, an essential part of country music. But I don't think it's disconnected from the fact that so much of our political conversation is either explicitly or implicitly about this supposed impermeable divide between the, quote, real America and cities or places where, you know, more people live and more non-white people live, right? And it's all erasure. This is a deep and very, very conscious move. I mean, the fact that you, same for me, the fact that we didn't know that square dancing had Black roots, that's not accidental. You know, that's very much a product of this. And that's, again, why particularly Black country musicians and audience members are so consistently pushing us to acknowledge that history because it has been very, very actively removed from the story.
And I want to say something about nostalgia, but before I do that, I do want to bring up, because I did find this, I thought it was really interesting about Henry Ford. It was called the Dearborn Independent. June 1925. They had these like articles that were doing these campaigns to popularize square dancing. And in particular, Henry Ford had a moral opposition to particular dances, typically from members of certain religious denominations, which was due to their introduction from abroad, presumably South America, the tango, or Africa, the Charleston, right? To your point, with which I think the Charleston was originated, I guess, like in not Harlem, but that area of Manhattan that no longer exists. It got through urban renewal, Lincoln Center, San Juan Hill. It was created in that section of New York City. And you know, he found those dances, the tango in Charleston, offensive, and he wanted to revive dances that would be identified as American and would stand on moral ground. So I think that's really interesting that you bring that up about Henry Ford. I was like, that is super interesting that he felt that square dancing would be, you know, was this, I guess, morally upstanding type of dance. And like, I guess the dance of these other people is just, you know, right, voodoo devil dancing.
Exactly.
But I do want to say something about the historical about the nostalgia. When I think about country music, I think about sort of like this nostalgia for the Old South, and almost even like, even though modern country music isn't singing about that, like somehow I do associate it with the antebellum South. I just do, you know what I mean? And it's so interesting because we did a series on historical nostalgia, and we talked with a psychologist from the UK, and she did a study. She did like an empirical, like, you know, she actually studied patients because she wanted to study, you know, what sorts of people are more prone to experiencing historical nostalgia, which is defined in their profession, which is distinct from personal nostalgia. Personal nostalgia is something that you have personally experienced in your life, and it's usually, you know, traced back to your childhood, like early childhood or, you know, early teens, things like that. Versus historical nostalgia is you longing for a time that you never actually experienced yourself. And and she said those things can be triggered by, you know, they're oftentimes triggered by music and smells, movies and things like that. And so I think it's really interesting when you, you know, because there's also particular, I think, aesthetic that sort of makes me feel that country music, our contemporary understanding of it, like is somehow an outgrowth of like old Dixie. Just sort of like implicitly, it's not something, you know, it's like that's not a comfortable place for Black people, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, totally.
So
totally. No, well, and I guess one thing I did just briefly want to add too about the square dancing thing, right, is that part of it also, of course, was that, you know, Ford was very concerned about the sexuality of these dances and the sort of fear of Black and brown sexualities, which is and the way that relates to this idea of purity in country music, which of course is also very simplified and is not actually what the music is about. You know what I mean? But it's just so interesting how those things intersect. But, and I think that you're absolutely right, that there is the sort of original sin of country music is this veneration, implicit veneration, or sometimes straight up explicit veneration for the Old South. And that continues. It's not as prominent as it used to be by any means, but you know, you still occasionally will have country songs that come out that are really like nostalgic for the antebellum period, or and you know, honor the Confederacy. Even a few years ago, a country singer named Josh Turner, who's from South Carolina, a white country singer, he had this song on one of his albums that was, it was about being from South Carolina and being from the low country of South Carolina. And it was this very kind of typical, you know, very, very beautiful in some ways kind of discussion of his home and why he missed it, right? Which is that thing, that country music thing. But then the third verse was basically about, you know, all these former generals, one in the Revolutionary War, but then one in the Civil War, a Confederate general who fought for a way of life, and we honor them to this day, you know. And so you do still kind of hear this. And I think the thing that's so important about that is that it indicates just how much country music can become a way that people talk about race and history, even if they're not listening to country music. And I think that one of the reasons why, say, the Lil Nas X situation last year.
We're going to talk about him too. We're going to talk
about
him.
Exactly, right? Like one of the reasons why that became so big and so ubiquitous was because of the fact that even people who'd never heard that song, who didn't listen to country music, they read the details of that situation, and they immediately understood because of the way that this has been really a symbol and a mechanism for this. And the other thing I would add too about historical nostalgia and musical nostalgia is that, again, to bring it back to blackface minstrelsy, right? One of the key things that I think people forget about or don't know, right? And I certainly didn't know it, about this veneration for the Old South and this veneration for the old folks at home and the you know, all of this stuff that is even about a world before the Civil War. But then again, with Dixie and that kind of lost cause and all of this, that one of the primary ways, if not the primary way, that this became such a deep part of our national discourse and our national identity is because of blackface minstrelsy, which is rooted in the urban North. And I think it's such an important reminder of the kind of depth of the American problem, right? That this nostalgia for the antebellum South culturally is so much a product of the post-war urban North, right? That it is about white people in places like New York and Boston and elsewhere, and certainly in southern places too. But in these northern cities, dealing with the aftermath of a war that most of them as white people in the North weren't fighting for any kind of black equality, right? They didn't support it. They didn't want it. There were a few who did, but they were a minority, even in the North. And so now they're faced with a post-war world in which not only are black folks free, but black folks are moving to New York and Boston.
And we're definitely going to talk about Lil Nas X in a little bit. Last Monday, when we spoke with Jack, we talked about the advent of race records. And he said in 1920, Mamie Smith records Crazy Blues, and it sells over 100,000 copies. And then the recording industry is like, oh shit, there's this like massive market for black recorded music. Like black people want to hear some people sing, or black people can sing. I mean, I don't know what people were thinking back then, but apparently that was the thing that, you know, let the recording industry know. And at that time, in the 1920s, the recording industry was new, and record labels had been struggling because they had been losing market share with the introduction of radio. Ralph Peer was working for one of those struggling record companies. Can you talk about Ralph Peer and his role in country music?
Absolutely. And he's such a crucial figure in American music for so many reasons. Peer's idea simply put, was that there were these market shares, right? There were these demographics of people who were not being served directly by the recording industry. And he was smart, but he also understood that there was this hunger. And he understood that both among people who were living in rural spaces or Black communities in other places, or people who had moved, right? And one of the things that Peer recognized was in this period of migration, particularly the Great Migration of Black folks, but also a sort of broader sort of Southern migration, right? And a lot of white folks from the country and from the rural South were moving either into Southern cities or northern places like Black folks were. He recognized that there was this tremendous opportunity to sell records to those groups of people who had been basically either marginalized or kind of ignored. And he also recognized a talent pool, right? You know, he and a couple of the other early talent scouts and record men, and they were basically all men at this period, who pioneer the industry. One of the things they realized very quickly was, we're missing out. We're not only missing out on who we can sell to, but all of these musicians who have these blends of kind of older music, very idiosyncratic vernacular style from their particular area, blended with what they're hearing on records or in vaudeville or in touring shows or in early radio, even at that point, that this is something that's very important and very different. So Peer becomes so crucial. And country music, because of what he does in Bristol, he's there at really the origin point for the music. And not to oversimplify it, because there were artists in the 20s that preceded the Bristol recordings who were very important, including a man named Fiddlin' John Carson, who's really has kind of the first big hillbilly record. He has like the first hit in what we would come to call country music. And it is so perfectly representative of where country comes from. On one side is an old fiddle tune that would have been played at the dances that you're talking about. And on the other side is the little old log cabin in the lane, which is, I mean, even from the title, you can tell it's a song about the past. It's a song about what used to be. It's a song about longing for that. And it sounds very much like it came straight out of the antebellum South, or it came straight out of, you know, someone in, you know, Mississippi or Georgia or Virginia, when it was actually written by professional Northern songwriters to be performed in minstrel shows, right? I love that story, because that right there, that record, in that record, you hear that duality, right? And it happens again with the two main artists who come out of Bristol, Jimmie Rodgers, who is a solo male singer. He he pioneers that persona of the kind of rambling man outlaw that would, to this day, is a central part of country music. He also is kind of the first country lover man, right? Which is sort of a less prominent thing that we talk about, but has been really important in country music. True. Up again today to people like Sam Hunt and other folks. But Jimmie Rodgers is deeply influenced by the blues. Jimmie Rodgers is deeply influenced by jazz. He actually records one of his songs with Louis Armstrong. So he's got that synthesis that is made for being a pop star, but is also rooted in a tradition. And the other artists, the Carter family, they are the family. They are a man and two women. And the two women are sort of the primary leaders of the group as far as people would hear on the recordings. And so that's the beginning, really, of women in country music being this centrally important creative force, but also being associated, for better or worse, with a sort of domestic sphere and trying to push against gender norms. Even the Carter family in the 1920s and 30s is recording songs that are trying to talk about, like, I'm a woman and I'm in a certain situation and I'm associated with a certain set of values, but maybe I'm not completely, happy with that or comfortable with it. And when you hear them, like, you don't hear the blues in them as much. You don't hear jazz in them, but they were very influenced by the blues as well. And in fact, a couple of their early songs were quite frankly, lifted by A.P. Carter, who was the third member of the group, from Black sources. And so both those key artists represent how country emerges out of this multiracial mix, but represents this deeper and often very troubling history of race and culture in the United States.
And just as, you know, you had race records, this music that you're talking about at this time is called hillbilly music. Mm-hmm. Hillbilly. Around what time did hillbilly music then become, like, when did the executive say, okay, we're going to rebrand this? Right. Like, what time period was that?
It was in the 1940s, mainly. Okay. By the 50s or so, it's basically country.
Okay.
And it was very much done because they didn't want the music to be associated with, they didn't want it to be associated with a kind of niche audience. They mm-hmm. didn't want it to be associated with a kind of disrespectful term. Mm-hmm. You know, hillbilly is certainly, particularly in the way that it was used in that period, you know, it could often be very pejorative. And they didn't want it to be associated with the past because they were modern musicians. They were modern moneymakers. They, you know, so they were kind of resisting that idea because hillbilly had this sort of connotation.
Yeah.
And country, you know, one of the things about country is it has less overtly racial undertones than hillbilly does, right? But that didn't mean they were actually changing what they were going to do.
Basically, Black people and white people, they're singing the same music. But this hillbilly music, so essentially, it's marketed to white people to promote, you know, white artists and this aesthetic and this rustic white Southern experience is essentially. And I'll ask you a question that's analogous to a question that I asked Jack. Are country music and blues essentially the same music, but they're racialized categories?
That's a very interesting question. I don't think they're exactly the same. I think there's enough space in both of them that is incorporating things to greater degrees than the other side is incorporating. Mm-hmm. And I think that with country music, there is unquestionably a sizable influence of sort of British Isles, kind of generally speaking, sort of folk traditions and musical traditions. There's influence from certain kinds of ballads. So it is not, the lyrical form is often very different. And with blues is also from the very beginning incorporating jazz, incorporating different kinds of. So I don't know that they're exactly the same. Like thematically, country music is often kind of reckoning with some of the same things that the blues is. Like, you know,
that's
some
how,
of the
like,
great
as someone who doesn't listen to country, that's how I see the country. Like, oh, they're singing the blues. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like, to me, right? Yeah,
oh,
I'm not
totally,
yeah, and I'm sure there's probably more like complicated, like, you know, musical elements that.
Right. Yeah. No. But it is. They are, and in terms of culturally, they're very, very similar. And I think country music is deeply influenced by the blues. Deeply, it's as influenced by the blues as it is by anything. But it's also influenced by a lot of other stuff. By the same token, the blues is deeply influenced by country. Blues predates country in a certain sense. But one of the things that I think is really important that I learned a lot doing my research is that the story of country music's influence on R&B and on soul music and on the blues and on other things is really deep. And it is about not just kind of Black folks being the sort of well springs of influence for white country musicians, but it's also about this sort of call and response where, you know, Black musicians hear Jimmy Rogers or they hear Hank Williams or they hear Dolly Parton or whoever, and they are kind of incorporating that into their own mix. And I think that's something that kind of gets lost a lot too. And again, it becomes something that a lot of times ends up being a way to sort of imply that white people are more musically adventurous than Black folks, which is, of course, ridiculous. But it's a narrative that gets put forward a lot. And I think it's rooted in that kind of, frankly, colonialist impulse to sort of take everything we can and then pretend we invented it. or pretend that we're the ones who made it interesting. So yeah, country is real bluesy in a lot of ways, and lyrically for sure, vocally, in terms of its themes and sentiments, and in terms of how it plays culturally as an expression of a lot of things, including struggle, but also joy, sexuality, survival. You know, the blues being kind of fundamentally about survival. Country, in a sense, is doing that too. But it's obviously, most of the time, at least when you're talking about white artists, it's a different set of things that they're trying to survive.